أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum. Forgive me for last week, I missed the class. Alhamdulillah. Sheikh Lu'ay covered all our classes. Allah yati al-afiyah. We'll get right into it, inshallah. Today, I'm going to spend a bit of today's class just doing a revision. So this week's the second last week. So today's just going to be a revision of what we've covered so far, which will bring us onto our conclusion next week. So I wanted to spend a bit of time just going over everything, just so we can understand, I guess, the structure of everything that we've learned. So obviously we're studying Uloom al-Quran, which is the studies of the different sciences within the Quran. Okay, especially so when the ulama go into it. And I know last week the last few weeks, we looked at specifically the Tafseer and those features of the Quran needed to understand, I guess, the Tafseer. But obviously we started off with the Quran and what is the Quran. Again, for those that are joining us now, I'm going to send a little quick overview of everything that we've covered. Then we looked at revelation and the nature of revelation. We looked at the first revelation and the last revelation that came down, and the stages of revelation also. Then we looked at the Quran as a whole. We looked at the completion of the Quran, how Jibreel alayhi salam, towards the end of the Prophet ﷺ's life, he would revise the Quran. And it's very clearly understood that the Quran orally was compiled in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So orally the Quran was compiled, and it's always been a complete Quran. And I guess the Quran in its structure it's in complete tact, in complete order. And like we said, this is from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And it was after the time of the Prophet ﷺ we looked at how the Sahaba were very concerned, especially in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Umar radiallahu anhu. They were very concerned about the Quran being remaining for the rest of the ummah, especially after the event of so many Huffaz passing away. So they said, well, how do we compile this so it doesn't get lost? Because if Huffaz keep dying and keep passing away, and then how are we going to preserve this Quran? Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already given us the promise of the Quran being compiled. But we looked at the effort of the Sahaba, and we looked at the way that they held the Quran, the way that they understood the Quran, the way that they understood the effort that they needed to make towards the Quran. I really want to emphasize that. The effort they needed to make towards the Quran, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the promise of Him preserving the Quran, them as individuals, the Sahaba and the later generations that came, they looked at, well, what is my contribution going to be to the preservation of this Quran, to the understanding of this Quran? Because I don't honor the Quran. Quran is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's Allah's book. But any effort that I make towards the kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this is an honor for me. So we looked at the hardship and the effort that they made and the concern that they had. And I love the example of when Umar radiallahu anhu, he came, Abu Bakr hesitated, because how can I do something that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not do? But then they understood through mashura, through deliberation, through understanding, through dialogue, through discussing with each other, this was the thing to do. And we see the same reaction when Zayd bin Thabit radiallahu anhu was given the task of doing such a thing. And then again, as time passed, we had the compilation of the Quran in the time of Abu Bakr, and that was put into a mushaf. And then in the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, where they started to disagree. They started to disagree on, I guess, its recitation and its understanding. And we looked at the different, how they started to disagree because their teacher pronounced it a way and someone else pronounced it a different way. They started to get into disagreement. Then again, they said, well, we need to take it to the next phase. So what is the next phase? And then again, they went through the whole process of ensuring that the Quran was kept and understood in the best possible way. And they went through, again, led by, or with Zayd bin Thabit involved with that, they went into that and they preserved the Quran as we know it today. And we said with time, as time went past, dots were added and the harakat were added and things like that. And then obviously the divisions, etc. Then we looked at obviously the causes of revelation, why revelation was revealed, and we looked at this in the form of as a science for the ulama of tafsir. So for the mufassirin, when a alim makes, or any learned person makes a tafsir of the Quran, he doesn't just make it because he heard someone else say, especially these tafsir that we refer back to. There's so many sciences that they needed to know, and then we looked into that. So we said, how do we make tafsir of the Quran? So we said the Quran, especially when the mufassir look at it, they said, well, they look at the Quran gives tafsir of itself. Then they looked at, well, where do we find this tafsir in the Sunnah? And then where do we find it in the sayings of the Sahaba, then the Tabi'een, and then from then on they went to the Arabic language. So they have a process. This is the words of Allah, and we said just the concern that they had when sharing knowledge, and the concern that they had on speaking about the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the earlier generation, we don't see them commenting very much on, like the big Sahaba commenting much. We have a handful of Sahaba that commented on the tafsir of the Quran, because they had a very close connection to the Prophet ﷺ. They were there when the revelation came, and the Prophet ﷺ gave them, some of them were given special authority, and we see how they lightened the way in this. And then subhanAllah, so they had that process, but they also put very, very much effort into it. The last lesson we looked at was the Makki and Madani chapter. So we looked at how do we define a Makki chapter and a Madani chapter, and we went into the details of that. Today's lesson also adds to the idea of a science that is needed to make tafsir of the Quran. These two. So we're looking at two sciences today, again, which are sciences within themselves. And we're looking at al-muhkam. First of all, we're looking at al-nasikh wal-mansukh. Al-nasikh wal-mansukh. The abrogating and the abrogated verses. So some of us might have heard of these. Today, and just a heads up, I'm going to keep it very, very brief, just for our understanding. These sciences can go into so much depth, as we've seen with so many of the other things that we've discussed. In any science, there's obviously always going to be the debate and differences of opinion amongst the Sahaba. For our purpose, obviously this is an introduction, so we're going to keep it extremely basic just for our understanding. If anyone has any questions, we might finish a touch earlier. So if anyone has any questions that wants to understand anything, we'll try to address them. But basically, when we look at the nasikh and mansukh, we're looking at, and we're going to look at it from a verse perspective. It's the removal of a ruling in Sharia over time, or the changing of, but more the removal of a ruling in Sharia. So I think we're on page, not sure what page you guys are on, but we're on the abrogating and the abrogated verses. So this science looks at those rulings that were changed, and most likely in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So we're looking at this from a Sharia perspective. The nasikh is the verse that is abrogating, and the mansukh is the abrogated verse. A lot of the nasikh and mansukh took place in the Madani phase. It took place in the Madani phase. That's when a lot of the rulings came down. And when we look at the nasikh and mansukh, we look at the verses that abrogate halal and haram, or that look at halal and haram. So I take it. The nasikh and mansukh refer to those verses with halal and haram. So I'll give you an example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have sent down a ruling at a specific time, and then later on in time, that ruling would have been removed or changed. And for an example to use it in modern day, for instance, is, as people develop, they do things differently. So you as a parent, for instance, you're walking your kid to school and you hold their hand and you say, you're never allowed to cross the road unless mom and dad are with you and we're holding your hand. And as that child gets older and they become more aware and they develop, then you say, you know what, now you can cross the road on your own. So it's a change. Something has changed. So we see this in Sharia, and we see this especially in the Quran, with certain verses. So sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a ruling. Sorry. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a ruling that was applicable for a certain amount of time, and then another verse came that removed that first ruling. Some people can, and again, so it's in regards to Sharia. It's not in regards to, for instance, our foundation of our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we look at the nasikh and mansukh, we don't look at it in, a nasikh and mansukh does not occur, for instance, in our belief system. So Allah subhanahu or stories or information that was given. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't give a set of detail, an event in history, and then change that event. That nasikh mansukh doesn't apply to that. It applies to halal and haram. What was applicable in one phase, and then later on, that was changed. And when do the ulama make, when they go back and they look at, well, what's the nasikh and mansukh? They'll always try to find an interpretation of a verse that might seem like it's a mansukh. If it gets to a point where there's clearly you can't make a ruling between the two, they're clearly contradictory, then they have to apply this rule of nasikh and mansukh. And this changed over time. So it's when there's no reconciliation between a ruling in the verses of the Quran, then they'll make a nasikh of one of the ayat. But now, how does this take place? The alim needs to know, and that's what we looked at Makkah and Madinah earlier, when that verse was revealed. So a verse doesn't become abrogated. A verse doesn't become abrogated unless a verse after it, the abrogating verse, was revealed after it. So let's say a verse was sent down. The verse that gets abrogated was sent down. The abrogating verse had to have been revealed after it in time. So when a scholar looks at the verses that are contradictory in nature, and obviously, and they can't reconcile between the two, they will look at it and say, well, which verse was revealed first and which verse was revealed second? And the second verse will abrogate the first verse that was revealed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So an example of this is in the first example that we have here. So we don't have the example of sitting down, but we're looking at the first example of what are the types of abrogation. Okay, so it's the Quran abrogating the Quran. So when the Quran abrogates the Quran, we apply this system of which verse was sent first, which verse was sent second. There's no reconciliation between the two. Now let us, the second verse will abrogate the first verse that was revealed. Okay, and an example of this is we see in Surah Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals the verse 240, where if a woman is widowed, or her husband becomes a mara and she is widowed, then like nowadays, still part of Sharia, then a woman has to go into her iddah phase. Okay, which is she has to stay at home. I'm not going to go into the details, but she'll have to stay at home. She stays in the home of whether it's hers or her husband's. And there's certain rules that apply. The first verse that we look at, which is 240, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that a widowed woman has to apply the iddah for 1 year straight. So for 1 year, she's meant to be given provision and she has to be in her iddah. As time went past, um, the next verse was revealed that abrogated the first verse, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now changed the iddah period for a widowed woman, where he now the ruling is that a widowed woman has to do her iddah for 4 months and 10 days. 4 months and 10 days, or 4 months and 10 nights. So this is probably one of the clearest verses that looks at abrogation. So that ruling applied for a certain period of time, where a woman was, if a woman's husband passed away and was married and she's widowed, then she had to do her iddah for 1 year. And that was applicable at that time. That ruling was applicable at that time. And then later on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, within His wisdom, knowing that this needed to be changed, and Him always knowing it was going to change, sent down the following verse that abrogated that first ruling. Another example, if we look at point 3, which is the Quran, so I'm looking at the Quran abrogating the Sunnah would be the example of the Qibla changing, for instance. So the Qibla was a certain direction towards Jerusalem at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and they always prayed that. They always prayed towards Jerusalem. Then as time went past, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down to the Prophet ﷺ the verse telling him that you can now turn towards Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, and that is your new Qibla. So the Sunnah was a certain way, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent verses to abrogate that ruling. Again, nothing was changed, the salat, nothing was changed, but other than the ruling and the way I think should have been done. And like we mentioned, this is it's not a blemish in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah changed. No, Allah knew. Allah always knew. But to make it easier for the people, especially the first generation, things were applied over time, and it was changed. I hope that's clear. What is the ruling of the abrogating or abrogated verses? So now all of a sudden both of those ayat are still in the Quran. Do we now not recite that ayah? No. So that ayah remains in the Quran, and its recitation still remains a worship. So its recitation still remains a worship, and it just means that its ruling isn't applicable anymore, but it's still the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's there for us to clearly see. That that part of Sharia, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us this ability, especially to our prior generations, that this is applicable. But it's also important to, especially when, like I said, this is in relation to tafsir. The ulama, especially the ulama of tafsir, and we spent so much time on praising them. But honestly, it doesn't matter how much we praise them, we can't praise them enough. The effort that they put into this, and the effort that they put into this is because they had to go into so many other sciences to do this. Not just that, okay, there's a contradiction, Adin is contradictory. And a lot of the Orientalists, they'll go into this and say, the Quran is contradictory. Well, Allah, if they open up and they see the efforts of these ulama, then we clearly see there is no contradiction in our deen. Allah, there's no, especially in the kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, absolutely no contradiction whatsoever. And this is obviously one of the sciences that looks at that. But a lot of these ulama, again, like we said, a lot of the other sciences, they're standalone sciences. They're so great that, some ulama, they'll spend so much time to write just one book on just this science itself. And some of the earlier scholars that wrote books on this were Makki ibn Abi Talib, who's about 400 years after the Hijrah. And we had another maybe a more famous one is Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who's about 550 years, passed away about 540 years after the Hijrah. Some of the later scholars, or closer to our time, that wrote sciences on this, and put a lot of effort into this were As-Suyuti, Allah yarhamu, who was, we know who As-Suyuti is. He's the author of Al-Itqan, which is maybe one of the most renowned books of Uloom al-Quran. And maybe I think one of the last scholars to actually write anything on this was a Indian scholar whose name is Sheikh Waliullah al-Dahlawi. So he's one of the more contemporary ones. And they clearly, obviously, they all have difference of opinions of which verse is nasikh mansukh, but that we gave one of those clearer ones, and they change over time. But there isn't, you wouldn't say there isn't many verses that I sort of abrogated. Again, it's when there's a clear no reconciliation between two verses, as we mentioned, because especially in those two verses, they're recited very similarly, but the ruling is different. So you can't reconcile between them except to say that one is what has changed. And then obviously they'll go back to the Seerah and to look at that. Inshallah, that is very clear. So again, just quick overview, an-nasikh wal-mansukh, the abrogated and abrogated verses. Some verses in the Quran that might seem to be or are contradictory, so that they're contradictory in the Sharia and the implementation. One will abrogate the other, and the way that the first one abrogates the other one is it has to have come down afterwards. So the abrogating verse had to have been revealed after the abrogated verse. And remember, this is only in relation to Sharia and the way that we implement things. It's not based on our belief system. Excellent. The next subject we want to look at is al-muhkam wal-mutashabih. Al-muhkam wal-mutashabih. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so within the Quran there are verses that are very clear, and there are verses that are ambiguous in nature, which means that they might be a bit harder to understand. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we have the verse written there in front of us in Surah Al-Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He's the one that sent down the scripture. He sent it down to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says very clearly that some of these verses, they're very clear, and these verses that are very clear, they're kitab, they're the cornerstone of the scripture, and others they're ambiguous by nature, they're mutashabih. The fact that they're the cornerstone of the Quran, it means that they're the vast majority of the Quran. They're the foundations of our belief. They're the foundations of the Quran. I'm going to get into, again, what the two mean. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like we said, there are verses in the Quran that are very clear by nature, and there are verses in the Quran that are unclear in nature. So they're unclear to understand. So now when the ulama, they go into this, they give us the definition of what a clear verse is. Again, so the majority of the Quran that was revealed are verses that are clear. And what does that mean? It means they're very clear to understand. There's no ifs and buts about it. It's a clear verse to understand. And that's it, it's clear to understand. An ambiguous verse, a mutashabih verse, will be a verse that it's not very clear to understand. You have to think about it a handful of times, and it might have possibly it has a number of interpretations or a number of possible meanings. Okay, so the muhkam verse is a clear verse. A clear verse. Let me give you an example of a clear verse. A clear verse might be قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. There's no ifs and buts about it. There's absolutely no debate about it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. There's no debate about that. That's a very clear verse. Another example might be إِنَّا أَعْطَيْنَاكَ الْكَوْثَرَ. Very clear. The Prophet ﷺ was given abundance. Kawthar can be abundance. It could be, same thing. Obviously, we might get different, but it's very clear. The Prophet ﷺ was given a lot of things. A verse that is mutashabih is a verse that is ambiguous in its nature, like we said, but it's not very clear to understand. And we've got a number of examples written down there, but I guess the best one to highlight would be the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and Allah's hand is placed over theirs. Now this becomes problematic. We believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, we believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't have form, etc. so forth. We're not going into our Aqidah lesson now. But how do I now, it's not a clear verse. It's obviously not a clear verse. It's a hard verse to understand. So we call this a verse that is mutashabih. It's a verse that is ambiguous in its nature. It's ambiguous in its understanding. Another example would be the example that we have there is al-huruf al-muqatta'at, the separated verses. So the separated verses, alif, lam, mim, or qaf, or whatever, whichever one we look at, we all know what the huruf al-muqatta'at are. They're very ambiguous in their nature. What do they mean? Regardless of what the ulama, some of the ulama we went to try and interpret them that, but they're ambiguous. It's not something I pick up the mushaf, alif, lam, mim. Oh, I know what that means. No, I don't know what it means. So it's ambiguous in its nature. I read, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. I know what that means. And like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us, the majority of the Quran is clear. It's very, very clear for us to understand. So why do we need to know these? So we're going to look at some of the benefits. We're going to look at some of the benefits of knowing this knowledge, the clear and the unclear verses. Now, if the Quran was all completely clear, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the Quran clear, the whole thing was clear, then it doesn't leave room, it doesn't leave space for us to go out of our way and put effort into it. So, the Quran's clear, it says 1, 2, 3, 4. These ambiguous verses, it creates an eagerness, especially within these ulama, within this space. It starts to distinguish people. If the Quran was very clear, then we wouldn't have these giants, even within the Sahaba. Why did Abdullah ibn Abbas stand out? Because he understood the Quran, he understood the tafsir of the Quran. So it allows for certain individuals to shine. If the Quran was clear, we wouldn't put effort into understand, it's clear. We wouldn't put that extra effort into it. When I put effort into the Quran, the reward is phenomenal. And you can't even count the rewards. Just to recite a harakah of a letter of the Quran, we get 10 rewards. Imagine the one that strived his whole life to understand the Quran. And it encourages every individual, and more so the scholars, just to look into the Quran and to start to compare within the Quran and give tafsir of the Quran. And again, we looked at the nature of how they go into that. It opened up scope for different ulama and individuals to go into different sciences. Just to understand the Quran, we looked at some of the prerequisites that were needed. If it was clear, if the Quran was just very clear cut, then maybe we would get lazy. Maybe we would get lazy in our a'mal. Maybe we would get lazy in implementing the Quran, understanding the Quran. So it encourages us, these clear and unclear verses, that encourage us to put more effort into the Quran. But us as individuals, and even the ulama, it's preferred, it's more preferred that we put effort into the study of the clear over the ambiguous verses. They're clear, they're the foundations of our deen, they're the foundations of the Quran, they're the majority of the Quran. Now we shouldn't get lost in but why can't I understand that? Someone that sat down and ignored a clear verse over why can't I understand what alif lam mim is? And some people they get lost into this and I want to understand what alif lam mim means. It's not a clear verse, it's an ambiguous verse. Doesn't matter how much effort you put into it. I'm not saying you don't put effort into it, but focus on that which is clear, because this is the foundation of our deen. It's the foundation of our knowledge. What was the and to finish off, what was the attitude of the ulama, and even till today? What's their attitude when dealing with the clear and unclear verses? We can say there was two main phases of this. The first phase is the phase of the Salaf, where they would recite these verses and they would not leave them, but they take them, and that's it. I believe in this verse. They didn't give meaning on it. They didn't give interpretation on it. They believed in these verses, the verses that were unclear. Later on, and later generations that came after the Salaf, they tried to go into them and give interpretations of these verses. I'm not going to go into that, but they tried to give interpretation of these different verses. So again, I'm just going to give another quick review of this. If there's any questions, because we're going to, like I said, this science is, well, especially these two, they can get very, I guess, confusing. So I'm going to do another quick overview of this one, and then I'll wrap it all up. So we have our muhkam verses, which are our clear verses, and our mutashabih verses. The majority of the Quran is muhkam, is very clear by nature. It's very clear by nature. And some of its verses are mutashabih. They're ambiguous in their nature, and they're ambiguous in their understanding. So a clear verse is one that is easily understood, and an ambiguous verse is maybe it's not very clear, and it's possible to have multiple interpretations. I'm going to add this, which is the next layer, especially when looking at the clear and ambiguous verses that the ulama gave, I guess, as a definition, is that a clear verse, again, is easily understood, whereas ambiguous verse, some of the scholars said that the meaning is exclusive to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Its meaning is exclusive to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And further on, some of these scholars went in and said that a clear verse is a verse that any individual can understand. Like we said, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ إِنَّا أَعْطَيْنَاكَ الْكَوْثَرَ, so on and so forth. Whereas an ambiguous verse is a verse that we will need direction in understanding. Hence, we fall onto the ulama and the mufassirin, etc. We looked at, like we said, a verse that is mutashabih would be the example that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hand is placed over their hands, or the huruf al-muqatta'at. And why is it important that we have the clear and the unclear verses? It gives us a reason, but it makes us put a lot more effort into the Quran. Wallahu a'lam. And the position of those prior to us is, especially the Salaf, is they left these verses and they didn't go into the details of them, and they understood them as they were. Later on generations, the ulama started to, they started to give interpretation on it. Doesn't mean they said a clear cut, this is the tafsir of it, but they gave the interpretation on what they think those verses mean. Wallahu a'lam. So just to wrap it up, we looked at the nasikh and mansukh verses, a verse that abrogates, the abrogating and the abrogated verses, and they're verses that can't be, reconciled between, and they only refer to the Sharia, what is halal and what is haram, and they don't. Allah never contradicts. Our deen isn't contradictory. We say our deen isn't contradicted in its foundations, in its beliefs, but rulings can change, which is nasikh and mansukh. And even within the Quran, we find this, and we gave the example of the widowed woman, which initially her waiting period after her husband's death was a year, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the community developed, He changed that ruling. The verses are still recited, so they're still within the Mus'haf. They're not removed from the Mus'haf. They're recited, and their recitation is still a worship as all the other verses of the Quran. It's just their ruling is not implemented. And we looked at the example of the Quran abrogating the Sunnah, which also occurs where there was a certain practice within the Quran, within the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and that is later on abrogated by the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as in when the Qibla was changed. Wallahu a'lam. Excellent. Any last questions about that? All right. Inshallah, that was clear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open up for us. I know these two, especially these two sciences, can get confusing. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us and make us understand. Again, just to finalize it, these are in relation to, they probably don't affect me and you as individuals. Not that they don't affect, it's not a thing that we will necessarily dwell into, but it highlights the status of the mufassirin. and those that came prior to us, and those that still put a lot of effort into this, into understanding the Quran. I know they put so much effort, and like we said, they even dedicated much of their lives to write, I guess, books in this and give us an understanding of these sciences. Allahu a'lam. Inshallah, that's all from me. Subhanallah wa bihamdi. Subhanallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakallah khair.